The dust came in low and restless, crawling along the road like something alive that had lost its way across the prairie. It slipped through wagon spokes and boot leather, rattled dry mesquite branches, and laid itself thin across the windows. Of dry creek like a veil, no one had the strength to brush away. By the time the rider reached the edge of town, the sun hung dull and copper-red over the flats, and the cattle pens smelled of old blood and sour hay. He reined his horse just beyond the livery and sat there, saying nothing. The brim of his hat shadowing a face the wind had carved into patience. His name was Jonah Creed. Though no one there knew it yet, the horse beneath him was a rangy dun with a white scar running across its muzzle. The animal's flanks shivered with fatigue, and Jonah rested a gloved hand along its neck, thumb moving in slow, absent circles. He watched the town the way a man watches water he suspects is deeper than it looks. Dry Creek had been built without tenderness. Every plank and nail spoke of hurry and hard winters. The saloon leaned toward the street as if it were trying to overhear trouble before it arrived. Across from it stood the sheriff's office, fresh paint, bright windows, and a polished brass. Star-nailed crooked above the door, Jonah nudged the horse forward. The hitching post creaked when he tied the reins. He stepped down slow, joints stiff from travel, and dust lifted around his boots, like it meant to follow him inside. The saloon doors pushed open with a tired groan. The place smelled of whiskey. Sweat and tobacco burned too long. Cards slapped against a table near the back. A piano sat silent, its keys yellowed like old teeth. A few men looked up, long enough to measure the stranger, then returned to their drinks as if they had already decided he was no threat worth naming. Jonah removed his hat and brushed it once against his sleeve. He walked to the barkeep, a thin man with a graying mustache and a shirt collar wilted by heat, filled a glass before Jonah spoke. He slid it across. "Been expecting the dust to deliver somebody sooner or later," the man said. Jonah nodded once. "Water first." The barkeep paused, then replaced the whiskey with a tin cup drawn from a bucket behind the counter. The water tasted of iron and something faintly alive. Jonah drank half and set it down. A voice rose near the far table. Laughter followed, sharp and careless. Jonah didn't turn immediately, but his gaze drifted that direction on its own, pulled by the rhythm of it. 3 men sat there. One wore a deputy's badge pinned low on his vest, like it was decoration rather than duty. Another leaned back with boots on the table, spurs clinking idly. Between them stood an older man with a beard yellowed by tobacco, and a waistline pressing hard against a silk vest that had not been silk for years. And beside them, she stood straight despite the way her hands were clasped before her, wrists pale where rope had recently been cut. The hem of her dress bore travel dust, and one sleeve had torn near the shoulder. She kept her eyes lowered, but her chin held a line that refused to bend. "She ain't worth what you're a skin," the deputy said, swirling whiskey in his glass. The older man chuckled, wiping sweat from his temple with a red handkerchief. "You'll find she is. She's quiet. Knows how to cook, strong stock. That's rare out here." Jonah set the tin cup down carefully. The barkeep leaned closer to him, voice lowered. "That's Caleb Rourke. Owns the North Cattle Spread, and most of the town besides." Jonah didn't answer. "Girl's name is Eliza Harrow," the barkeep continued. "Father died last winter. Rourke held the note on their ranch. Debt come due." Across the room, the man with boots on the table laughed again. "Looks like she might bolt first chance she gets," he said. Rourke's smile stayed thin. "She won't." Eliza's fingers tightened against each other. That was all she allowed herself. Jonah turned slightly on the stool. The floorboards creaked under the shift of his weight. "Town sanction it?" he asked. The barkeep wiped the counter with a rag that only smeared the stain. "Sheriff signed the transfer papers this morning." Jonah studied the grain of the bar for a long moment, tracing a groove worn by years of restless hands. Then he finished the water and stood. He crossed the room without haste. The deputy noticed him first. His hand drifted toward the butt of his revolver, not drawing, only reminding it where he was. "You lost, traveler?" the deputy asked. Jonah stopped 3 feet from the table. Up close, Eliza's face showed a bruise fading beneath her left eye. She did not look at him, but he saw the tremor in her breathing. small as the flutter of a trapped moth. I heard you were selling something, Jonah said. Rourke's eyebrows lifted. This ain't livestock. No, Jonah said. It ain't. The saloon quieted in pieces, like a wind dying across tall grass. Rourke shifted, sizing him. And who might you be to speak on it? Someone with coin, Jonah said. The deputy snorted. Coin don't buy law. Rourke raised a hand, silencing him. His eyes narrowed with interest. You thinking to purchase her debt? Rourke asked. I'm thinking to settle it, Jonah said. Rourke leaned back, chair groaning beneath his weight. Debt stands at $460 plus legal fees, plus my inconvenience. Jonah reached inside his coat and produced a leather pouch. He set it on the table. The sound it made when it landed was heavy and final. Rourke untied the cord, peered inside, then glanced up again. Suspicion flickered through his expression. Why? He asked. Jonah met his gaze, steady as horizon. Because I'm tired of watching men mistake ownership for righteousness. The deputy's chair scraped the floor as he stood. You best mind your tongue. Jonah didn't look at him. Rourke's fingers hovered over the coins, weighing possibilities. Finally, he smiled again, though the expression held less certainty now. Paperwork'll need sign-in. He said, Then we sign it, Jonah replied. Eliza's head lifted slightly. For the first time, her eyes moved to Jonah's face. They were gray like storm clouds, and they held more disbelief than hope. The sheriff's office smelled of fresh pine boards and old ink. Sheriff Milton Graves sat behind his desk with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, rocking slowly in his chair while he watched the transaction unfold. He was a tall man with pale eyes and a jaw that had never learned the shape of regret. You understand, Graves said, dipping a pen into ink. This don't constitute marriage annulment. Only transfer of obligation. Jonah nodded. Eliza stood near the window. The fading sun lit the dust floating around her hair, turning it briefly into something like gold. She hadn't spoken since they left the saloon. Graves slid the document across the desk. Sign here. Jonah signed. Graves turned the paper toward Eliza. And you, Miss Harrow? Acknowledge receipt of settlement. She stared at the page as if it were written in a language she had never meant to learn. Her hand trembled when she took the pen. The scratching sound of her name filled the room with something fragile and breakable. When she finished, Graves folded the paper neatly and tucked it into a drawer. Congratulations, he said flatly. Outside, the evening wind had risen. It carried the smell of distant rain that would never reach Dry Creek. Jonah stepped onto the porch. Eliza followed, stopping a pace behind him. You bought time, she said quietly. Jonah turned halfway toward her. I bought your freedom. She shook her head, slow. No one buys that. He studied her, seeing the way she held herself like a structure built after collapse, careful, deliberate, always ready to fall again. You got somewhere to go? He asked. She hesitated. Our ranch was taken in spring. There's nowhere left that calls me by my name. Jonah nodded once as if he expected no other answer. I've got a place, he said. South of the river, it ain't much. She watched him in silence. A wagon rattled past, wheels grinding over stone. You expect payment? She asked finally. No. You expect gratitude? No. She searched his face for something she could recognize. Whatever she found unsettled her more than cruelty might have. Then why? She asked. Jonah looked out toward the desert, where twilight was gathering like bruised velvet across the sky. Because I remember a day nobody stepped forward. He said he didn't elaborate. She didn't ask. They left Dry Creek. Before dawn, the trail south cut through miles of scrubland, where the earth split open in dry veins and jackrabbits darted like fragments of wind. Eliza rode a borrowed mare beside Jonah. They spoke little. The rhythm of hooves and leather filled the spaces between them. Near midday, they stopped beside a dried arroyo. Jonah watered the horses from a canteen while Eliza sat on a rock, turning a small silver locket in her fingers. You lost someone, she said without looking up. Jonah capped the canteen. Lost a wife, he answered. She nodded as if she had already known. Men burned our homestead, he added after a while. Said I owed them grazing rights I never promised. He didn't mention the small pair of boots he'd buried beside the cabin ruins. The memory hovered anyway, heavy as thunder. They resumed riding. By evening, they reached a modest spread of land nestled against a low ridge. A weathered cabin stood there, flanked by a leaning corral and a windmill that turned with tired perseverance. Eliza dismounted slowly. She walked toward the cabin door and rested her palm against the wood, as if testing whether it would accept her weight. You can stay as long as you need, Jonah said. She turned back to him. And you? I'll stay. Till you're ready to leave. Her expression shifted, something like relief, something like fear of believing relief was possible. Weeks passed in careful quiet. Eliza learned the rhythms of the ranch. She mended fences with hands that bled before they hardened. She cooked meals neither of them spoke much over. Sometimes she would stand at the edge of the pasture at sunset, staring toward a horizon she had once thought she would never see again. Jonah worked beside her, never crowding, never prying. One evening, as storm clouds gathered low and purple, she found him repairing a saddle strap. "They'll come," she said. He didn't look up. "Rourke?" "And the sheriff," she said. "Men like that don't forget when coin slips from their grasp." Jonah tightened the strap with steady hands. "Then we'll be ready." Fear moved through her eyes, quick and sharp. "I don't want blood spilled because of me," she whispered. He set the saddle aside and stood. "Blood spills when men think they own what breathes," he said. "Not because someone stands against it." Thunder rolled far off, slow and warning. They came 3 days later. Dust rose on the northern trail, carrying 5 riders. Rourke rode at the center, his vest bright even through the haze. Sheriff Graves rode beside him, expression carved from stone. Eliza stood in the yard, hands trembling at her sides. Jonah stepped forward, resting his palm lightly near his holster but not drawing. Rourke reined his horse 10 paces away. "You've interfered with lawful business," he called. Jonah said nothing. Graves leaned forward in his saddle. Town council reconsidered the settlement. Funds were found to be counterfeit. Eliza's breath caught. She looked at Jonah, searching his face for denial. "They ain't counterfeit," Jonah said evenly. Graves shrugged. "Town says otherwise." The silence stretched, taut as wire. "You hand her over," Rourke said, "and we forget this unpleasantness." Eliza stepped forward suddenly. "I won't go," she said. The words shook but did not break. Rourke's smile faded. "You don't decide." Jonah moved then, placing himself half a step in front of her. "She does," he said. Graves' hand drifted to his revolver. Last chance. Wind swept through the yard, rattling the corral gate. A loose board clapped once, sharp as a gunshot. Jonah's eyes flicked briefly toward Eliza, then back to the riders. "Right away," he said quietly. "No one else needs to die over pride," Rourke laughed, but it sounded hollow. The first shot came from the deputy riding at the far end. It struck the dirt near Jonah's boots, spraying dust across his coat. Then the world fractured into thunder and smoke. Jonah moved with a calm born of long grief. His revolver cleared leather in a smooth arc. The deputy tumbled from his saddle before the echo faded. Graves fired next, grazing Jonah's shoulder. The impact spun him half sideways, but he fired. Again, shattering Graves' gun hand. The sheriff screamed, clutching his wrist as blood streamed between his fingers. Rourke wheeled his horse, trying to flee, but Eliza had already stepped forward, gripping Jonah's dropped rifle. Her hands shook violently, yet she held the barrel steady. "Stop," she said. Rourke froze. For a moment, the entire frontier seemed to hold its breath. Eliza's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "You took everything from my father," she said. "You tried to take me like I was cattle." Her finger tightened on the trigger, then loosened. "Ride," she said. Rourke stared at her, stunned by mercy he had never imagined from prey. Slowly he turned his horse and fled across the flats, dust swallowing him whole. The yard fell silent except for the windmill creaking overhead. Jonah sank to one knee, blood darkening his sleeve. Eliza dropped the rifle and rushed to him. "You're hurt," she said, voice breaking. "It's shallow." he murmured. She pressed her hands against the wound, panic shaking through her. Like cold rain. Why didn't you let me shoot him? She whispered. Jonah looked out toward the empty trail. Because then he'd still own part of you, he said. Winter arrived early that year. Snow dusted the ridge in thin, uncertain layers. Jonah's wound healed slow but steady. Eliza kept the ranch alive through long nights and bitter mornings. By spring, word spread across neighboring towns of a woman who had faced down a cattle baron and spared his life. Some called her foolish. Others called her formidable. Most simply spoke her name with a tone that suggested something sacred had been tested and endured. One dawn, Eliza stood outside the cabin watching sunlight spill across the pasture. Jonah stepped beside her, coat slung over his shoulder, hat in hand. You're leavin', she said without turning. He nodded. You built something here. She said, so did you. She faced him then, eyes bright with questions she no longer feared asking. Where will you go? Wherever the road forgets my name, he said. She stepped closer, searching his face with quiet intensity. You don't have to leave, she said. He studied the horizon a long time before answering. Some men carry ghosts that grow restless when they stay too long, he said softly. Tears gathered in her eyes but did not fall. You gave me my life back, she said. Jonah shook his head. You took it back. I only opened the gate. The wind stirred her hair across her cheek. She reached out and pressed something into his palm, the silver locket she had carried since the day he met her. Take it, she said. So you remember someone stayed free because you chose to care. He closed his fingers around it, throat tightening with words he would never speak. He mounted his horse. The animal shifted beneath him, eager for distance. Eliza stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself as if holding together something. Fragile but enduring. Jonah tipped his hat once. Then he turned toward the southern trail and rode into the rising light. Dust lifting behind him like a curtain, closing slow and solemn across the land. Eliza watched until the horizon swallowed him whole. The windmill turned above her, steady and patient, singing its lonely hymn to a sky that had witnessed cruelty, mercy, and the quiet stubborn courage of those who refused to be owned. And the prairie, vast and indifferent, held their stories. The way it held all things without judgment, without forgetting.